Once, they came as enemies. In the villages of Vietnam, American soldiers arrived with guns, fire, and chemicals that poisoned the land. The skies rained Agent Orange, and generations of children would be scarred by an invisible enemy long after the war was over. But what if I told you that decades later, some of those same soldiers came back, not with weapons, not with orders, but with open hands, gentle voices, and hearts full of guilt and love. This is the story of Matthew Keenan, a U.S. veteran who once wore the uniform of an invader and who now calls himself a father to the very children Vietnam calls its victims. It is the story of enemies who became healers, soldiers who became caretakers, a reminder that sometimes the greatest act of courage is not to fight an enemy, but to embrace them, because love is the only force powerful enough to outlast war. Enemies in a land of fire. The year was 1971. A young man named Matthew Keenan, just 20 years old, left his home in New York and boarded a plane to a country he barely understood, Vietnam. To him, it was just another assignment. He was an administrative specialist, moving between Cam Ranh Bay, Chu Lai, and Da Nang. But to the people who lived there, he was something very different. He was an invader, part of an army that had turned their homeland into a battlefield. The war in Vietnam was not just fought with guns, it was fought with chemicals. Agent Orange, the toxic herbicide sprayed by American planes, blanketed jungles and fields. Soldiers like Matthew marched through those places without fully realizing the consequences, but the Vietnamese knew. The chemicals seeped into their soil, their rivers, their food, and worst of all, into their bodies. Matthew left Vietnam in May 1972. He was relieved, like most American soldiers, to be going home. He returned to college, became a lawyer, married, raised children, built a life. But Vietnam did not leave him. It lingered like a shadow. Years later, Matthew's own body began to betray him. Doctors told him he had prostate cancer. The likely cause? Agent Orange. For the first time, Matthew felt in his own flesh what millions of Vietnamese families had endured for decades. But his suffering was temporary. He had treatment, family, and resources. In Vietnam, children were still being born with twisted limbs, missing eyes, broken minds. Children who had never seen war, yet carried its scars every day. And here was the cruelest irony. Matthew, the soldier, was now a victim of the very chemical his army had unleashed. He could not escape the war's legacy, but he could decide what to do with it. That was the moment the story shifted. The moment when an enemy began to wonder, what if I could return? Not as a soldier, not as an invader, but as a human being, to help the children of those I once called the enemy. The return of the enemy. In 2015, more than 40 years after he left, Matthew Keenan returned to Vietnam. The world he found was no longer the war-torn landscape of his youth. Da Nang was a bustling city, full of scooters, markets, and the sound of life. But hidden in its corners were places where time had stood still, places where the war still lived. He found them in the daycare centers of DAVA, the Da Nang Association for Victims of Agent Orange. The first time he walked in, he expected sadness. What he found instead was laughter. Children with bent spines, missing limbs, or cognitive disabilities were playing games, drawing pictures, or trying to kick a ball. Matthew did not stand apart. He knelt down, he picked up a crayon, he kicked the ball back, and for the first time in decades, he felt something unexpected: peace. He came back again and again and again. 9 times since 2015, each visit lasting months. He became a familiar figure, the tall American with gray hair, singing, dancing, playing basketball, and laughing with the children. But Matthew was not content just to play. He fixed broken toys, repaired chairs, planted gardens. He raised funds to buy TVS, sound systems, even swings, so the children could feel the joy of moving through the air. He fought for a bigger bus, so the children would no longer be crammed dangerously into a van too small for them. The staff saw his devotion, the children felt his love, and slowly, something incredible happened. The enemy became family. The director of Dava, To Num, said it best. He is not just a volunteer. He is one of us, but the truth went even deeper. Matthew wasn't just helping strangers. He was helping his own enemies' children. Children who, had they been born 50 years earlier, might have been hiding from him in fear. Children whose grandparents may have watched American planes spray their land. And yet, here was Matthew, kneeling beside them, not as an American, not as a soldier, but simply as Uncle Matthew, when enemies become fathers. With each passing year, Vietnam became less of a destination and more of a home. Matthew began calling Da Nang his second home. He rode motorbikes, ate bowls of pho, laughed with friends, and walked the beaches at sunrise. He taught English to curious students by Hoan Kiem Lake. He lived not as a foreigner, but as a neighbor. And at the daycare centers, he was more than a visitor. He was a father figure. He helped children write their names, guided their coloring, taught them basketball. He didn't pity them. He treated them as equals. When a boy in a wheelchair, one of his favorites, passed away during the Lunar New Year, Matthew wept. When his fellow veteran Jimmy Thompson, also exposed to Agent Orange in Da Nang, died of cancer, Matthew grieved again. But grief did not drive him away. It anchored him deeper. Because Matthew understood something few could. He and these children were bound by the same poison, the same invisible legacy of war. He was one of them, and they were his. He once carried a rifle in Vietnam. Now he carried crayons and soccer balls. Once he represented an army. Now he represented reconciliation. The transformation was complete. The enemy had become a father. The legacy of love. Matthew Keenan's story is not just about one man. It is about the possibility of transformation. The war in Vietnam divided nations, scarred millions, and left behind wounds that seemed too deep to heal. But Matthew's life shows us something extraordinary, that even the deepest wounds can give birth to compassion. He once came as a soldier, part of a force that unleashed devastation. Today, he comes as a father to the very children of that devastation. And in his journey lies a truth we all need to remember. Enemies are not permanent. War creates them. Humanity dissolves them. The image of an American veteran holding the hand of a Vietnamese child born with disabilities tells us more about peace than any treaty ever could. It says, "We were once enemies, but now we are family." When Matthew's mother taped the words, "Welcome home," love, peace, happiness, to the door when he returned from war in 1972, she could not have imagined that those words would find their truest home decades later in a daycare center in Da Nang. But they did. And through Matthew, they live on. The question his story leaves us with is simple and haunting. If a soldier can return to the land of his enemy and become a father there, what excuse do we have not to love? Because in the end, love is the only thing strong enough to outlast war.